There is usually nothing more annoying in the adrenal section than congenital adrenal hyperplasias to people. And I will tell you that I myself, when I was a medical student, skipped the subject. But we also have a way of doing this where you don't have to understand anything. Now, you can have a single enzyme deficiency, 17-hydroxylase deficiency, 21-hydroxylase deficiency, 11-hydroxylase deficiency. And I can see already some of you are curling up and saying, I think I'd rather study cardiology twice, and I understand that. Congenital adrenal hyperplasias is why many people end up going into orthopedic surgery. Understanding these is difficult because there's 3 of them, and they all have different numbers. So you can have a congenital defect in any of the enzymes that lead to a deficient cortisol secretion, all of them called congenital adrenal hyperplasias. Now, all of them result in a loss of cortisol. So all 3 have low cortisol. That's automatic. Next, what's the feedback inhibition on the pituitary besides cortisol? Nothing. Since cortisol is the only feedback inhibition on the pituitary, if you lose cortisol, all of them have a high ACTH level. All of them. Cortisol is the only feedback inhibition on the pituitary. Since you lose cortisol, all of them have a high ACTH level. And that's why they're all called congenital adrenal hyperplasias. Because adrenals are hyperplastic because they've been stimulated by an excess ACTH. Oh, yeah. Now, it may be hard to understand what we mean by a horizontal cut of the pathway. But if you look at a picture of the pathway, it's actually pretty clear because it looks like a horizontal cut of the pathway. And all the substances below that cut are damaged. And so therefore, a vertical cut, it's so interesting. Okay, a vertical cut like 17-hydroxylase means that you don't move to the right of that pathway, meaning you don't make things in the zona reticularis. So there are 3 deficiencies: 21-hydroxylase, 11, and 17. If you were completely deficient in 21-hydroxylase deficient, if you were completely deficient, you would be completely dead because you would have no 11-deoxycorticosterone, you would have no aldosterone, and you would have no blood pressure, and you would be completely dead. Now, 21-hydroxylase deficiencies, therefore, by definition, have to be partial. They have to be partial. And that's because this is also the most common of them, but it has to be a partial deficiency. Because if it was total, you would be totally dead. All of them result in a low cortisol. Since cortisol is the only feedback inhibition on the pituitary, all of them have a high ACTH. And since cortisol is the feedback inhibition, we give prednisone to all of them to act as feedback inhibition on the pituitary. This has to be a partial deficiency. So looking at the zona glomerulosa from the top down, you get cholesterol off the LDL. You can make cholesterol de novo from acetate. Angiotensin II touches the receptor. Angiotensin II stimulates the second messenger to stimulate desmolase. And then pregnenolone is an intermediate step. When you are deficient in 21-hydroxylase, you have no aldosterone. And if you have no aldosterone, you can survive if you make a little 11-deoxycorticosterone. Now, just after 21-hydroxylase there, you'll see the word 11-deoxycorticosterone, 11-doc. 11-doc acts like aldosterone and therefore can maintain blood pressure. But because 21-hydroxylase deficiency results in decreased 11-doc and decreased aldosterone, the blood pressure is low. The blood pressure is low. In the next image, we see that the blood pressure is low because there's no 11-deoxycorticosterone, no 11-doc, and there's no aldosterone. So the blood pressure is low. But if you can't make anything in the glomerulosa and the fasciculata, the productive capacity of the adrenal shunts over to the right. And when it shunts over to the right, you end up getting an excess in adrenal androgens. So you may not be able to make 11-deoxycorticosterone. You may not be able to make cortisol, but you can make an awfully big clitoris and a lot of hairiness. So what do you get instead? You get adrenal androgens in big excess amount. You can't go down the glomerulosa to 11-doc or to aldosterone. You can't make cortisol, so the ACTH is up. Because the only feedback inhibition is cortisol. So you have to think of that ACTH like a pressure on the adrenal gland. And that pressure pushes the hormones into the reticularis, pushes the pressure of the hormones onto the reticularis, which makes DHEA and androstenedione. You do not have to distinguish between DHEA and androstenedione because from the point of view of our purposes, they are essentially identical substances. They are adrenal androgens. Under normal conditions, those adrenal androgens would mean nothing, do nothing, produce nothing. But excess amounts results in virilization, hirsutism, male pattern hair loss, big clitoris. The deficiencies in these fasciculata and reticularis, the zona glomerulosa has no aldosterone. The fasciculata and the reticularis, you would normally make 11-deoxycorticosterone, but here you don't. So your blood pressure is low because you've lost all your mineralocorticoids. You therefore have no sodium, and since you've lost mineralocorticoids, you end up acting like Addison's disease. So 21-hydroxylase will look an awful lot like Addison's. High potassium, low blood pressure, low sodium, low volume, and high potassium. And you'll maintain blood pressure because the renin and angiotensin are up. So why don't you die entirely? Because the renin and angiotensin are up trying to snatch your blood pressure from killing you. The decreased corticosterone and cortisol results in an ACTH that pushes a pressure on the adrenal. That's why you have adrenal hyperplasia, because it's a productive pressure on the adrenal gland. So a look at this picture will show you that if you can visualize where the blocks are, you can visualize that it's like a dam in a river. If 11-hydroxylase is deficient, it ends up laying like a dam in the river, and everything builds up behind it. So you'll notice no cortisol, so the ACTH is up, and it's hypergrowth of the adrenal because you have ACTH pressing on the adrenal. You can see that it will shunt over to the androgen side on the right because the pressure of the ACTH from on top shunts everything also into adrenal androgens. You'll also see that 11-deoxycorticosterone will build up because that is the precursor, the one step before the 11-beta-hydroxylase, and that will build up as well. And because 11-deoxycorticosterone builds up, it raises the blood pressure. 11-deoxycorticosterone raises blood pressure because it acts like a mineralocorticoid. All of them have a high ACTH. All of them have hyperplasia. All of them can be treated with steroids because prednisone is feedback inhibition on the pituitary. The effect in the zona glomerulosa when you're missing that 11-beta-hydroxylase is a high 11-deoxycorticosterone, raising the blood pressure. 17-hydroxylase deficiency blocks the production of cortisol. I think it's easy to see that if you have 17-hydroxylase deficiency, you can't have this pathway go to the right. No cortisol, high ACTH. High ACTH, adrenal hyperplasia. You can also see that if you don't go to the right, you can't all of a sudden skip things and have things go make adrenal androgens. So the androgens are gone, and that's why people who have 17-hydroxylase deficiency are missing all their precursors. Now, they're not just missing them in the adrenal, they're missing them in the gonads as well. And that's one of the things that people don't often understand, is that you're not just missing these enzymes in the adrenal, you're missing them everywhere. And that means your gonads are all smooth underneath you like a Barbie doll. So therefore, you don't make gonads, you don't make estrogen, you don't make testosterone, because the estrogen comes out of the testosterone. Now, the only thing that's hard for people to understand is that why do you still get a low level of aldosterone? That's because 11-deoxycorticosterone builds up. And what does 11-doc do to blood pressure? Up or down? Up. And that elevated blood pressure shuts off angiotensin II. And you need the angiotensin II for the aldosterone synthase to be effective. You need the angiotensin II for the aldosterone synthase to be effective. When you have a high angiotensin II, you'll make the aldosterone, but the high blood pressure shuts off angiotensin II, and you have low aldosterone. You have a high blood pressure from 11-deoxycorticosterone, but you have a low aldosterone level. Now, this is a slice of it in the testes. There's a little testicle carpaccio here. And remember that you're not just missing 17-hydroxylase inside the adrenals. You're missing it in the testicles too. And that's why you're not making testosterone, because you're missing it in the testicles too. And therefore, no cortisol anywhere, and no DHEA or androstenedione. And if you don't have androstenedione or DHEA, you can't make testosterone either. Oh, equal time for ovaries, ovaries, ovaries. Equal time for ovaries. I can't make them either. Oh, if I don't make testosterone, my ovaries not alone. I can't make testicles. I can't make anything at home. I got no estrogen. I got no testosterone. I'm not going to get a date, and I'm going to be alone. Why? Because I got no gonads. Everything's empty. I have an empty feeling inside. Where? My ovaries. Let's summarize these enzyme deficiencies. First of all, you'll see that almost all of them have in common low cortisol. Here we just changed the name to glucocorticoid. Because glucocorticoid or cortisol is the only feedback inhibition on the pituitary, all three have a high ACTH. Now, they don't all have a low or high blood pressure. And when you see under mineralocorticoid, DOC means deoxycorticosterone. Every time the DOC or deoxycorticosterone is low, the blood pressure is low. And every time the DOC or deoxycorticosterone is high, the blood pressure is high. So DOC and blood pressure go together. Oh, yeah. So in 21-hydroxylase, the blood pressure is low and the androgens are high. 17-hydroxylase, that all of these come down to blood pressure and androgens. If you look at them, you'll see that's the only difference between them. Blood pressure and androgens. 90% of congenital adrenal hyperplasia is 21-hydroxylase deficiency. In a neonate, because there's no aldosterone and there's no 11-deoxycorticosterone, you could end up losing all of your salt away, because there's nothing to make you reabsorb salt or water if you've got no aldosterone and no 11-deoxycorticosterone. So you can save the baby by giving the baby steroids or fludrocortisone or both. The salt wasters present with hyponatremia and a high potassium because that's what it would be like to be in instant adrenal insufficiency. And that's what this is. This is like being born with Addison's disease. Now you get an increased 17-hydroxyprogesterone and you get virilization. And sexual ambiguity means that the clitoris is as big as a penis because the androgens that have been exposed to the female baby in utero have turned the clitoris huge. And males don't really show anything at birth. You can't really tell. 11-beta-hydroxylase, clinically it seems similar to 21-hydroxylase because it's virilization. The biggest difference is blood pressure. 11-hydroxylase has high blood pressure because of 11-deoxycorticosterone, and the 11-deoxycorticosterone makes you lose potassium because it ends up like aldosterone. And the high blood pressure suppresses the renin. All congenital adrenal hyperplasias are treated with steroids because the glucocorticoids act as the feedback inhibition on the pituitary. And the feedback inhibition on the pituitary is going to shut off ACTH and will slow down or stop the hyperplasia. Our final slide in the adrenal section is to look at 17-hydroxylase, and it is that you are completely missing in all gonadal function because you can't make either testosterone or estrogen or even adrenal androgens. So you're hypogonadal. The only thing you can make is blood pressure because of 11-deoxycorticosterone excess. So what ends up happening is you have high blood pressure, but you look like a eunuch because you can't make androgens and you can't make estrogens, and everything's missing on you. You don't know what you are, and you can't make anything because you're missing things. However, look at the bright side. You can get it all replaced artificially and snatch your genitals from the jaws of death by puberty, and all will be well if you get your estrogen for women and testosterone for boys later on. It can all be fixed and treated. See you in the next section.